In the previous video of this series, I started the construction of my Spitfire FR.XIV kit in 1/48 scale by assembling and painting the pilot. Join me in this video as I construct the all-important cockpit at the centre of the aircraft. Hi, I'm Matt and you're watching Model Minutes. Before I start the video, a quick shout out to my patrons. The contributions these guys make go directly into keeping the channel going, so a massive thank you to you. Take a look at the links under the video in order to learn more about becoming a patron and what it gets you. A quick word of warning before I start building. Please remember that adult supervision may be required due to the use of sharp tools and toxic paints and chemicals. The first step I chose to complete was to build the framework which will ultimately contain the pilot's seat. I do tend to build the cockpit a little out of sequence from the recommended method in the instructions. This is based on my preference to assemble all the parts that require the same paint colour prior to cementing them together. If different coloured parts are to be joined together, I'd rather paint them separately beforehand. The components were snipped off their sprues and then cleaned up. Throughout this build, I do this either by scraping away the excess plastic with a sharp knife, or by sanding it smooth with a nail file. I then cement them together by applying Tamiya extra thin cement to the bonding points and push the parts together until they start to set. I use Tamiya extra thin cement throughout this build as it flows really well and is easy to apply thanks to the included brush in the lid. The next step was to paint the parts that were to be an aluminium colour with Humbrol 56 acrylic paint. I'm using this straight out of the pot for now, as I've found that it comes out quite thin already. I'm using a medium-sized brush to get quite quick coverage, as being neat at this stage doesn't really matter, seeing as more paints will be used later on. Next, Humbrol 78 Cockpit Green Acrylic was thinned with Tamiya acrylic thinners. I'm doing this by eye, but it's about 2 parts paint to 1 part thinner. Thinning your paint will help avoid leaving brush strokes in the final finish, as well as speeding up the drying time. You may find that a number of thin layers are required in order to get a good even coat. I'm using this paint colour on the previously assembled frame parts, along with the internal walls of the cockpit and any other components that may require it. I do this whilst they are still on the sprue, which aids in holding them during the painting process. When I come to remove these parts later, I'll touch up any missing paint as I need to. Again, I'm using a medium brush in order to cover as much area as I can. Being the internal areas of the aircraft, I don't feel neatness needs to be as accurate as not everything will be visible. Humbrol 85 Coal Black Satin Acrylic Paint was then brushed onto the various components that the instructions indicated. These consisted of some controls inside the cockpit, along with the control panel. The instructions call for Humbrol 62 leather for the various seat parts, but as I didn't have that colour, I instead opted for Humbrol 29 matte earth acrylic. I thought this would make a reasonable alternative and could represent a seat that has been worn and made a bit dirty with use. Here, the 2 internal cockpit halves have been removed from the sprues and cleaned up. I'm going to cement the various parts that the instructions indicate should be installed here. It is worth noting that at this stage, the first image calls for the small wheel part to be cemented where I actually place it, but in the next image in the instructions, it's actually cemented into the little hole in the sidewall. This appears to be an error on the instruction writer's part, not making it particularly clear where it should be glued. I will fix this error off screen later, when I eventually spot it. The parts that make up the pilot seat are then assembled. I found this to be quite fiddly as these components are rather thin and small. A good set of tweezers and even clamps would be helpful here, as I found it difficult to align the tiny grooves with my fingers. Here you can see that I've added the control panel onto its frame. I'm about to apply the decal to the control panel. I've applied Humbrol decal fix all over the decal paper, which will in time allow the decal to release from the surface. I normally use water, but seeing as it was just the one decal, I thought that would be a bit of a waste. The control panel part has also been given a coat of decal fix, which will help to soften the decal into place when it is applied. Seeing as the paint finish on the control panel is already satin, I did not give it a further layer of paint like I would normally do with a matte finish. This satin finish will help avoid silvering the decal when it is applied. The decal was slid off the backing paper and carefully aligned on the control panel. If you are careful, you can get all the little dials to line up with the moulded detail. A further coat of decal fix was then applied and the decal left to cure. The seat assembly can now be cemented onto its frame. You must take care here as the parts are quite delicate and could be easily crushed. Also, some patience may be required as the bonding surface areas are very small, and the parts may need a little extra time to bond together. At this point, I'm touching up any missed areas with Humbrol 78 Cockpit Green. I'm using a finer brush this time to ensure accurate placement of the paint and avoid placing it on any of the other parts. Citadel non-oil black acrylic wash was used to then highlight the various details. Normally, I remove excess wash with a thinner soaked cotton bud, but for this build, I won't. Instead, I'll leave it as it is, giving a bit of a grimier appearance. Now comes the majority of the assembly. The various frame parts are slotted into place and secured with cement. The side parts then sandwich around them and create a nice snug cockpit assembly. The final addition was the pilot. A little bit of fiddling was needed to ensure that the control column sat inside his hand, and when he was in place, more cement was used. And here's the finished cockpit, complete with pilot. I found this to be one of the more detailed cockpits I've completed so far on my channel, especially bearing in mind that I normally build smaller scale kits. There are many more moulded details that could be picked out in more relevant colours, but for the whole, I've followed Airfix's instructions and managed to get fairly good results. The build is relatively easy to complete, but is quite fiddly at times due to the finely moulded parts being quite small and thin. This difficulty can be compounded by the fact that some of the parts are being held together by bonding surfaces that might only be a couple of millimeters large. Generally though, I feel this builds up into a fairly well detailed cockpit which looks quite good. Join me in the next video where I start to add this cockpit assembly to more of the aircraft. As always, please let me know what you think of my build, techniques and finished model in the comments below. I'm keen to hear any suggestions you might have for improvements, tips or other videos you'd like to see on my channel. All that's left to say is thanks for watching, and I'll see you all on the workbench again next time.